Today, we are transitioning to the Harlem Renaissance, this important and significant artistic, literary movement in the early 20th century. And before we talk about Claude Mckay and Zora Neale Hurston, the two writers I asked you to read for today, I thought I would say a little bit just to create a kind of foundation regarding the Harlem Renaissance. And you'll notice on D2L in the additional information and materials module, I have a lot of information, a lot of additional information about the Harlem Renaissance that I would encourage you to explore. In particular, many of those podcast episodes, the one, I believe it's the first one that I list on Van Vechten, is actually quite good, and that's a great place to start. But the Harlem Renaissance is a way of foregrounding this. Part of what made this possible was the Great Migration between approximately 1910 and 1920. Significant figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who we have already discussed, encouraged members of the Black population in the American South to move or migrate north into relatively abandoned areas in New York, such as Harlem. And there were other cities as well. Chicago, I think, is an excellent example of a place where Black Americans in the South went or migrated to during the Great Migration. While it is impossible to know exactly how many African Americans migrated from the American South into these northern cities, many scholars, for example, estimate that nearly 300,000 African Americans potentially migrated from the American South to these northern cities. And again, the number itself is often disputed because it's not like people counted or again, I think for reasons that are self-evident, it's impossible to know exactly how many Black Americans migrated from the American South to these northern cities. But the Harlem Renaissance, just again, as an aesthetic, as an artistic, as a literary movement, it's important because it was this moment when African Americans attempted to create or establish a sense of cultural identity in a predominantly white world and in specifically predominantly white neighborhoods and boroughs like Harlem. Like many things, the Harlem Renaissance began to waver when the stock market crashed in 1929, and of course, the following decade with the Great Depression, that certainly didn't help. But in that subsequent decade, many prominent Black artists and intellectuals fled places like Harlem for economic reasons. But as we discussed when we read writers like W.E.B. Du Bois, the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction in the 19th century left many African Americans feeling disillusioned. Because of this, two competing but not mutually exclusive themes emerged during this period: racial pride and resentment. Both of these themes are quite visible in the literature, art, and music of this period. The takeaway, I suppose, from this movement is the way in which its proponents legitimized Black identity. The sense of unity and community helped to codify the notion that African Americans are human beings who deserve, among many things, equal treatment. And you might find, in particular, this notion of legitimizing Black identity, it's something that figures like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois certainly wrote about. Before them, it's something that figures like Frederick Douglass and Phyllis Wheatley wrote about. This is a theme that constantly emerges, it seems, in American letters, in American history, and it's still something we grapple with today. So, some important figures, and we will read many of these figures, with the exception of Louis Armstrong, because he was a musician. But Langston Hughes, Claude Mckay, Zora Neale Hurston, and again, I mentioned Louis Armstrong, all extremely important figures to the Harlem Renaissance. And there are many more. That is not a comprehensive list. But today, I asked you to read Claude Mckay and Zora Neale Hurston, and I think I want to just start with Claude Mckay. So I asked you to read 4 of Mckay's poems, and these 4 poems from this section represent many things, or they communicate and dramatize many things, but part of what we see here is the glorification of Black identity and too often the sense of objectification many African Americans felt during this period. Many of the poems in this section describe audiences objectifying through a kind of gaze a Black body or Black bodies. We see this, for example, with Harlem Shadows, which I will talk about in just a moment. This sense of voyeuristic objectification is key to someone like Mckay. And what I mean by voyeuristic objectification, just the way certain objects appear or receive a kind of emphasis within a visual field. And I think film is a great example of this, or a great example of how this works if you think about the camera and how it functions. But it's this way of placing Black bodies, especially in the poetry of Mckay, under a kind of objectified scrutiny. And again, something you'll notice if you pay close attention to his poetry, and I think we see this in his Lynching poem in particular, how the Black body, especially the Black body as it is brutalized and mutilated, is this thing, this spectacle for people to look upon, and perhaps to do so with a kind of perverse enjoyment. But let's actually start with Harlem Shadows. And this poem begins on 469, and I'll just read it, so follow along with me, and then I'll offer just a couple of thoughts about it. I hear the halting footsteps of a lass in Negro Harlem when the night lets fall its veil. I see the shapes of girls who pass to bend and barter at desire's call. Ah, little dark girls, who in slippered feet go prowling through the night from street to street. Through the long night until the silver break of day, the little gray feet know no rest. Through the lone night until the last snowflake has dropped from heaven upon the earth's white breast, the dusky half-clad girls of tired feet are trudging, thinly shod from street to street. Ah, stern, harsh world, that, in the wretched way of poverty, dishonor, and disgrace, has pushed the timid little feet of clay, the sacred brown feet of my fallen race. Ah, heart of me, the weary, weary feet in Harlem, wandering from street to street. So here, and perhaps Mckay doesn't use this language specifically, but I think he is clearly writing about these young girls, or he's attempting to dramatize these young girls who are, perhaps due to certain unenviable economic and social conditions, are prostituting themselves. And one of the ways that we can see perhaps this negative trajectory from the beginning of the poem until the end is to focus on feet and how the descriptions of feet shift and change from one stanza to the next. Notice, for example, in the opening stanza, the feet of these, quote, dark girls, they are slippered, and they go prowling through the night from street to street. So here at the beginning, there's this sense that their feet are covered and protected, and perhaps you could even do a fair amount of analysis with a word like slippers. They're not shoes or boots, they're slippers. Why is that distinction important? But even a word like prowl, I think, is important. And I'll continue to talk about this as we move throughout the poem, but prowling feels powerful, doesn't it? When you prowl, you're a predator. So notice, according to Mckay's speaker or narrator, these girls, they go out but they do so with a kind of power, with a kind of agency, with a kind of force. But notice how it quickly changes or shifts. So in the second stanza, for example, we learn that their feet are now gray. This is the second line of the second stanza. Of day, the little gray feet show no rest, or excuse me, no rest. So here they were in the first stanza, these slippered feet, and the girls in question were prowling. They seemed to have power. They seemed to have, again, this predatory instinct. But now their feet are gray. The night is lone or lonely. So the sense of power and the sense of agency that, according to Mckay's speaker, they had or possessed, that's clearly gone now, or if anything, at least it's waning. And the idea that Mckay clearly wants to communicate, he crystallizes it here in the final stanza. If you look in the final three lines, the sacred brown feet of my fallen race. Ah, heart of me, the weary, weary feet in Harlem wandering from street to street. So we're told now their feet are weary. They're no longer in slippers. They don't seem to have or possess the kind of comfort they had early in the poem. But I mentioned, and I've mentioned it a couple of times in this lecture, that word prowl. But notice now how Mckay describes them, because they're no longer prowling, they're wandering. So we have, again, this negative trajectory from prowl to weary or to wander. And I guess I would encourage you to pause over this and think, what do you imagine Mckay wants to do with this, or what is he doing with this? Is this reference to feet, or are these references to feet meant to represent or symbolize something much bigger, something about the lives of these girls, and perhaps by extension, the lives of all Black women, not just in this period, but perhaps, again, this is a much bigger or a more far-reaching idea that Mckay wants to communicate to his reader. And I think one way that you can imagine that, again, this is not just about a single girl or a couple of specific girls. Perhaps, again, Mckay wants to make a larger and more far-reaching or more totalizing connection. These girls, they're nameless. They're just little girls. They're just these, quote, little dark girls. And something else that I think is important here, because Mckay, and when we talk about Langston Hughes, I'll certainly say something about, for a writer like Hughes, he often writes about Harlem in this way that makes it seem quite utopian, which is to say, Hughes has this tendency to write about Harlem in a way that perhaps ignores all of the forms of exploitation and objectification that were quite real. Again, you can almost see Hughes, and I'll talk about propaganda later in the semester, but you can see Hughes perhaps doing this kind of propagandistic work, and that is certainly not something Claude Mckay does. Claude Mckay has a far more realistic, a sobering, realistic impression of what Harlem was, what Harlem represented, and even though he doesn't mention it here, or he doesn't make explicit reference to it, perhaps you could say he does in the Harlem Dancer, the poem that appears before this poem on 469, it is not just entirely possible, but it is almost certainly true that the men who paid for these sexual exchanges with these little dark girls, they were not people of color. They were white. And this is something, again, that Mckay was extremely interested in exploring, perhaps disabusing his reader of this notion that places like Harlem were these safe meccas, these utopian paradises for people of color, because that wasn't entirely the truth. So you see in Mckay's work and in Mckay's poetry this active attempt to depict and characterize Harlem as it was, and not, as for a figure like Hughes, how it should be or how it ought to be. And I think in that way, Mckay, and specifically Mckay's poetry, has this palpable sense of tragedy attached to it. And that's something, again, not that Hughes just wrote propagandistic poem after propagandistic poem, because he didn't, but there is a sense of optimism in Hughes that maybe doesn't always exist, or it's a lot harder to find. It's not as representative as these kinds of poems, where what he's describing is, or has, far less optimism. It feels more pessimistic. And for those reasons, it, again, disabuses readers of this notion that Harlem was something that it, quite frankly, was not, or that, and I think this is perhaps the larger point, that in a predominantly white world that is so hostile toward people of color, that these little utopian pockets could ever exist. There's always this threat from the outside, and I think Mckay is just far more willing, or Mckay is prepared to show that to his reader, perhaps in ways that Langston Hughes or even Richard Wright, who we are not reading, wasn't. So again, that's not to say that Wright wrote nothing but saccharine, optimistic poems, because he certainly did not. So, okay, let's also talk about one of his poems on 470 that I asked you to read, The Lynching. And this is a genre of poetry that was extremely popular for writers like Richard Wright, Claude Mckay, dramatizing and describing actual lynchings. And this is a difficult poem to read, and it's a difficult poem to talk about. So if you need to skip ahead a bit, I completely understand. But it's important to recognize what exactly Mckay wants to do, or why he would even write a poem like this. And if you know anything about the horrors of Jim Crow, you know that lynchings happened far, far too often, and there was very little, if any, legal recourse for the families of those individuals who were lynched. And if you know, again, anything about lynchings during the Jim Crow period, you know that they were these spectacles, again, this perverse kind of entertainment where a brutalized black body was quite simply put on display for a white audience. And again, follow along with me, and once I finish the poem, I will offer a bit of commentary. His spirit in smoke ascended to a high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to fate's wild whim, hung pitifully over the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view the ghastly body swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue, and little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in a fiendish, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. So if you're curious about the meter here, Mckay, he actually uses this interesting combination of Italian and Shakespearean sonnet forms, but one of the things I want to talk about, and again, you can explore that if you want, but what happens in these first four lines? His spirit in smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. Those first two lines, his spirit in smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain. Notice how, for someone like Mckay, he's potentially implicating God here in an interesting way, because that is precisely what he means by referencing his father in line 2, that and again, you perhaps need to acknowledge a kind of Christian context for this, but according to Mckay, this person who was lynched, there's almost this sense that God determined or predetermined that this was when he would die. This was when this person and God would reunite in heaven. But according to Mckay, there's something, quote, quite cruel about how God chose or elected to do this. Why, my God, would you ever do something like this, or permit or allow something like this to happen? And this is something you see Richard Wright also wrote a haunting poem about lynchings, and he similarly implicates God. And I think it's this larger question that we asked in particular after World War II and the truth about what Hitler and the Third Reich did or attempted to do to Jewish people. Just how on earth, how do we reconcile the existence or the supposed existence of a benevolent God when we see the sorts of horrors that humanity unleashes upon itself and the world? And again, I think Mckay, he's asking a similar sort of question here in these opening lines. And in the second half of the poem, we have this clear sense, again, of how this charred, mutilated body, it's not something that seems to horrify these spectators, but it's something to look at with a kind of perverse fascination and satisfaction. We're told, for example, the women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. So again, seeing, quote, this ghastly body, but not having what I think or suspect many of us would have, which is just a sense of horror and regret, sorrow and pain at seeing something so, again, ghastly. But it's the final two lines, really, this couplet, that crystallizes, I would argue, Mckay's larger point. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. And he's not subtle here. According to Mckay, these children, they're not just innocent children, but perhaps because of the cultural and political ideologies that inform their understanding of the world, their sense of right and wrong, it's inevitable what they will do. And this moment where they are dancing around this body seems to work or function or operate, again, as a kind of perverse foreshadowing. And when Mckay writes something like danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee, I always encourage my students to pause over those final two words and reflect on what Mckay might mean. What does that mean, fiendish glee? To what degree? For example, are they aware of what they're doing? But that's a line, and those are words in particular that I would really encourage you to think about, because I can imagine you could write an interesting essay, because you'll have an opportunity to do so later in the semester, about how certain individuals in much of the poetry I ask you to read, how some individuals react to and orient themselves to these just utterly horrifying scenes. Again, I think you see this in a poem like The Harlem Dancer. So it's just something to think about. You may want to put a pin in that if you like Mckay and you're thinking, I would like to write something about his poetry. That's potentially an idea worth exploring. So now I think, for just time constraints, I want to transition to Zora Neale Hurston. And I asked you to read this short essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me. But this essay in particular, I would argue, places a lot of Hurston's skills on display. Not only is she funny and sardonic, but she is serious and authoritative. Her tone matters so much in this poem. It's interesting because she also describes herself as fast brown, and I'll talk about what that means, because maybe you could argue that this places her in contrast to perhaps writers like Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois, but so much of this essay also helps to explain why Hurston was such a contentious and controversial figure during the Harlem Renaissance. And she certainly was. I mentioned this novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So this novel was discovered by, or rediscovered is perhaps a better way to describe it, by Alice Walker, when Alice Walker, I believe this was in the 1970s, was writing a thesis, or writing maybe her undergraduate thesis. I apologize, I don't remember the particulars, but she just found the manuscript for this novel in her university's library archives, and she did a remarkable amount of work to bring a figure like Hurston back into the literary canon, because again, Hurston, while she was a significant figure at the time, she had fallen perhaps out of favor, is perhaps not the right word, but she quite frankly wasn't recognized. Her contributions in subsequent generations and in subsequent decades were not recognized like they are today. Again, many people agree that, or many scholars of African American literature, especially in the 20th century, seem to agree that Hurston, she was arguably one of the best of this generation, and she potentially produced one of the best, if not the best, novel of this generation. So I think I want to start here on 534, and I'll read a couple of paragraphs right before this break on the page, and if you can, follow along with me. During this period, white people differed from colored, to me only in that they rode through town and never lived there. They liked to hear me speak pieces and sing, and wanted to see me dance the parse-mêlée, and gave me generously of their small silver for doing these things, which seemed strange to me, for I wanted to do them so much that I needed bribing to stop. Only they didn't know me. The colored people gave no dimes. They deplored any joyful tendencies in me, but I was their Zora nevertheless. I belonged to them, to the nearby hotels, to the country, everybody's Zora. But changes came in the family when I was 13, and I was sent to school in Jacksonville. I left Eatonville, the town of the Orleanders as Zora. When I disembarked from the riverboat at Jacksonville, she was no more. It seemed that I had suffered a sea change. I was not Zora of Orange County anymore. I was now a little colored girl. I found it out in certain ways. In my heart, as well as in the mirror, I became a fast brown, warranted not to rub nor run. So I'll stop there first. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is how the town reacted to these moments when she would seemingly entertain these white tourists, and she doesn't perhaps speak about this or explain herself as clearly as we would perhaps want. But I think what she's making reference to, and perhaps part of the reason why there was so much antagonism toward this behavior in her community, was because she, whether she realized it or not, was potentially fashioning herself as a kind of minstrel figure. And if you know anything about minstrel shows, you perhaps have a sense of why this was a problem. But she describes how when she left Eatonville and went to Jacksonville, she seemed to become aware of what it actually means to be, quote, a little colored girl. And all of the unfortunate racial dynamics associated with being colored, quote, in the way she describes it. And she says she became a fast brown. And this is an interesting phrase. And you could probably imagine she's actually using language on the page in a way or in a way to communicate what she perhaps means. Warranted not to rub nor run. These are really quick words, single syllable words that as a reader you move past or you read quite quickly. But I always ask my students to pause over this and consider what it means to be fast brown, because in the very next line, and this might offer a bit of clarity, she writes, "But I am not tragically colored." And I think I'll just continue to offer a bit of context. "There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a low-down dirty deal and whose feelings are all hurt about it. Even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong regardless of a little pigmentation more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife." So you might get a sense of why she frustrated and upset many of her black literary colleagues at the time. But I think this casts this phrase or this line, fast brown, in a clearer context, because I think for someone like Hurston, there is this sense, and again, she clarifies it in that paragraph that I just read, there is this sense that she will not allow racial prejudice to stop her or to slow down whatever it is she wants to do with her life. So she is quote brown, that is unavoidable and unmistakable, but she's not slow brown. She doesn't allow, at least in this essay, what she suggests is she doesn't allow the racist culture that she occupied, she doesn't allow it to slow her down in any meaningful way. And she constantly uses her first name, and she references herself in third person, Zora. And I think this is one of the ways that she almost constructs this powerful identity for herself, because she just keeps talking about herself almost like it's this kind of affirmation, this chant. If she just says her name enough, then perhaps she can defy or transcend the racist conditions that defined the world that she occupied. And I think and this is on the next page, 535, she has this interesting way again of developing this idea that she's fast brown and developing this notion that her skin color and her race is not necessarily a problem, because for Hurston, again, she almost turns this notion on its head by suggesting that it's actually white people who have a harder time. So again, even within context, you could see why Hurston was something of a controversial figure. But this is on page 535. This is at the top of the page, and this is what she says. The position of my white neighbor is much more difficult. No brown specter pulls up a chair beside me when I sit down to eat. No dark ghost thrusts its legs against mine in bed. The game of keeping what one has is never so exciting as the game of getting. And this is so cool, because what Hurston ultimately says and what she suggests here is you know just as much as I do where we will be eventually, inevitably. And because of the power dynamics that you, this white majority, has established, you will spend the rest of your life while you're in power doing nothing but attempting desperately to keep power. And I think Hurston here, she's also pivoting from this notion that it is, and I think we see this often when we desire a commodity. For example, if I wanted to use perhaps a non-racial, even banal example, just think about how it feels to want a commodity, something like a phone or a car or whatever. There is something discernibly disappointing about actually getting it. And yeah, there might be that euphoria of getting it. I'm not suggesting the minute it's in your hand, you feel despondent. Some of you might. I often do, for example. But eventually, you start to realize that, my God, doing everything I did to get this was far more enjoyable than the actual getting, because we often just recycle that same process. And I think Hurston here has a clear sense of what that means, that the pursuit of something is far more satisfying than these desperate attempts to keep what you have or to justify what you have. And then in this just beautiful rhapsodic passage after that break on 535, we again have this sense of not just who Hurston is as a person, but why I would say something like, by my estimation, she wrote the greatest novel of the 20th century, because she is able to communicate, or she can communicate in ways that are so lyrically satisfying. And I'll just read this whole paragraph. Sometimes it is the other way around. A white person is set down in our midst, but the contrast is just as sharp for me. For instance, when I sit in the drafty basement, that is the New World Cabaret with a white person, my color comes. We enter chatting about any little nothing that we have in common and are seated by the jazz waiters. In the abrupt way that jazz orchestras have, this one plunges into a number. It loses no time in circumlocutions, but gets right down to business. It constricts the thorax and splits the heart with its tempo and narcotic harmonies. This orchestra grows rambunctious, rears on its hind legs and attacks the tonal veil with primitive fury, rendering it, clawing it until it breaks through to the jungle beyond. I follow those heathen, follow them exultingly. I dance wildly inside myself. I yell within, I whoop, I shake my assegai above my head. I hurl it true to the mark. Yow, I am the jungle and living in the jungle way. My face is painted red and yellow, and my body is painted blue. My pulse is throbbing like a war drum. I want to slaughter something, give pain, give death to that I do not know. But the piece ends. The men of the orchestra wipe their lips and rest their fingers. I creep back slowly to the veneer we call civilization with the last tone and find the white friend sitting motionless in his seat, smoking calmly. Good music they have here, he remarks, drumming the table with his fingertips. Music. The great blobs of purple and red emotion have not touched him. He has only heard what I felt. He is far away, and I see him but dimly across the ocean and the continent that have fallen between us. He is so pale with his whiteness, then, and I am so colored. So one of the things that I really dig about this paragraph is just you kind of get this sense of maybe what Harlem at its best, this utopian Harlem, what it looks like and what it felt like to someone like Hurston. Because I think for her, this music and this environment, what it does, it has this effect of traversing civilization in some way. And it takes her back to something primitive, something African, because part of this move in the 20th century, part of this civil rights move was this turning aggressively away from a white hegemonic culture and perhaps retreating into Africa as not just a place, but more importantly, a symbol. And we can see Hurston doing something quite similar here. If you've ever read the play A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hainsbury, there's a character in that play called Assegai, and he very much embodies that part of the politics regarding civil rights and racial inequality in the 20th century. But all of this, just pay attention and mark the effect it has on her. And then once the song ends, once she returns to herself, she looks beside her and her white compatriot has felt nothing whatsoever. He seems completely void and vacant. And here again, she does this thing where she inverts not only what it means to be white and black or white and colored, but she fundamentally changes the power dynamics here. Because again, for someone like Hurston, she established this early in the essay, far too often to be, quote, colored is to be in a subordinate position relative to that primary or that powerful position that is white and that dominant position that is white. But here, notice how she inverts it. Because for her to be white, especially considering what she just describes and what she just experienced, to be white is to be nothing. It's to be void of anything and everything. And for her color, to be colored. And you could think of this notion of being colored in a couple of different ways. It's vibrant, it's alive in ways that her white counterpart is not. And I think what we see, and I'll pivot to this final point, then I'll end. I think what we see again in this moment, in this cabaret, is this sense of transcendence that Hurston, at least in this essay, is constantly searching for. Again, she's fast. She moves with this kind of propulsion, not unlike the musicians in that cabaret. And I think we see this on page 536. This is for many of my students one of their favorite parts of the essay. She writes, The Cosmic Zora emerges. I belong to no race nor time. I am the eternal feminine with its string of beads. I have no separate feeling about being an American citizen and colored. I am merely a fragment of the great soul that surges within the boundaries, my country, right or wrong. Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. So here, and again, such a my goodness, if someone were to say something disparaging toward you, can you think of anything better to say in response? But how can you deny yourself the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. That would be perhaps a wonderful retort. But I think what Hurston does here, and it's not just enough to say something like this, but it's the way she builds to it. Because I think as readers, if we are paying attention, we agree, right? How would you ever want to disparage this person, or how would you ever want to imagine that we should have a society that's separate but equal, a segregated society? Because why on earth would you ever want to deny yourself the pleasure of the company of a person like this? So that's perhaps all I'll say about Zora Neale Hurston and this essay, how it feels to be colored me. This essay, not only do I think is it representative of perhaps, again, what places like Harlem tried to be at their best, but also these different responses to the kinds of racist, segregationist policies and practices of the time, and how for someone like Hurston, again, she's so clever. She convincingly and persuasively shows just on the page what so many people, so many white individuals at the time denied. Okay. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Again, this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature, and I look forward to talking to you next week.